Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon here for the Popular Reporting Exemplified webinar. We'll begin here in just a minute or so. If you're just now joining us, hopefully you can hear us fine. You should be able to submit questions, which I'll talk about in a moment, but if there's any issues, please go ahead and let us know now at this time. But hopefully you can see my screen here. There's a slide here that says Popular Reporting Exemplified, Budget in Brief, and Popular Annual Financial Report. All right, for today's webinar, we have an agenda here where we're going to go over an introduction and an overview of the Budget in Brief and the Popular Annual Financial Report. We're going to explain the benefits of both of these documents, when you might use them. We'll discuss the content for the documents, the award requirements. We will also discuss the steps in the process of developing these, giving you timelines for both. And then we will discuss more about the design, distribution, and measurements. And ultimately here, working with the financial and communication teams and how we bridge those teams together to produce such a great document here that's going to help your constituents and stakeholders within your community. We'll also have time for questions at the end of our webinar today. So feel free to write those questions down, and I'll explain a little bit more in a second here. But you'll be able to give those to us throughout, as well as now. So today, my name is Scott Piner. I should introduce myself. I'm a consultant and account executive here at Sikich. I work with the external marketing team, and so we worked with Brian Caputo from the City of Aurora on the Budget and Brief and PAFR. So I work with many different clients throughout the years, working on different campaigns and helping them connect with their target audience. And when we began working with Brian, we were working on these two documents here and how these documents are going to help them connect with their constituents. Brian became the Chief Financial Officer and City Treasurer for the City of Aurora in 1998. He has held positions as Director of Finance and Treasurer for the Village of Mount Prospect and Assistant Finance Director for the Village of LaGrange and Hoffman Estates. Brian has been a presenter before with us on webinars here at Sikich, but he is also a certified public accountant and certified public finance officer. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
All right, we are now going to get started here, but I want to make sure I mention that today's webinar provides CPE credits. Throughout the webinar today, there will be a few moments where we'll have a polling question, and you don't have to get these right or wrong. It's not a correct, well, there is a correct answer, but it's to measure your engagement throughout the process. So, so hopefully you'll find the questions easy to answer. But if you do have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit those to us during, and if it applies, we will try to answer it as we can. And if not, or if it's something that we feel that's better to be addressed at the end, we will do it at that time. So we will, again, save 15 or so minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, and then you'll be able to also contact Brian or myself offline with other questions you may have. There will also be a survey at the conclusion of our webinar, and so we ask everyone to submit, to reply to that survey, giving us feedback on today's presentation. All right, so CPE credits, polling questions, and any other questions, feel free to submit throughout. And without further wait, let's get started. I want to introduce Brian Caputo here to explain a little bit about our Budget in Brief and Popular Annual Financial Report.
Good afternoon. Probably might be best to start off with why would you be attending a webinar, why are we offering a webinar with Sikich and one of its clients. Essentially, we came to Sikich with, we got stuck. We had a notion of producing a budget and brief, which we'll explain the details of that in a bit. It's a bit of a creative piece trying to make the budget more understandable for laymen. But we've been false starting on that for at least 2 years. Internally, we try to develop it, and I guess those of us that are accountants maybe need a little bit of creative help in something like that. Budget and Brief is a public document that's simple, creative, aesthetically appealing, and internally we could pull the numbers together and maybe had some vague notion of what a layout might look like, but actually getting into developing a document that was suitable for the public was a bit of a stretch. And in fact, even our mayor's office was kind of had the reins on us until we got it so it looked like it was a very pleasing document before we let it out. So after a few stops along the way, we called Sikich and said, you know, can you help us design something that's creative and appealing? So that's how this whole thing got started. And now let me tell you a little bit about these two, what I'll call specialty finance documents. Some of you may be more familiar with a popular annual financial report, so maybe I'll start there. So a popular annual financial report is essentially a abbreviated, layman-friendly version of a CAFR for the most part. It doesn't have to have all the information in there for a CAFR. Usually PAFRs don't, but there are pieces of a CAFR that are in there, and certain trends, trend charts, pictures, basically to tell a story that's easily digestible for a layman. Usually they're in the neighborhood of 16 pages or so. It could be longer, could be shorter. But if you were to go out to the GFOA website, you'd see many examples from across the country. And indeed, that's what we did to start to get some ideas as to what our PAFR might look like in Aurora. We do have one. Now, the budget and brief. The budget and brief is along the same line as a PAFR, but where the PAFR is a distilled version, so to speak, of a CAFR, a budget and brief is essentially a distilled version of a full budget. In the GFOA's definition, it can be a separate standalone document or actually part of the budget itself. But what I'm speaking of here is more of a standalone sort of document that the public can easily understand along the lines of a PAFR. So it's, again, can be any number of pages, but typically they're short. And in order for them to be easily usable by the public or public officials, the standalone presentation makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, why would one issue either one of these two documents? Well, I would posit a couple of thoughts there. One, it's a matter of professional pride. You're trying to do something that's just at the next level. Certainly, if you receive the budget award from the GFOA or the Certificate of Excellence for reporting, those are certainly great professional achievements. But this just takes it a little bit to the next level. And I can say that they're also issuing one of these documents exhibits transparency. Because they're easier to read, or should be easier to read, the layman can pick one up and get a feel for what's going on with the government financially, and depending upon your presentation, also programmatically. The informed community, a lot of times citizens don't pay a lot of attention to the financial reporting documents, much to the chagrin of finance officers. This is a way to maybe inform them a little bit better. There are great reference pieces. The budget and brief in particular for us got a lot of use this past year. We not only placed it on our website, but we also produced several hundred copies of it and placed it on the tables of the attendees at the city's State of the City address. So it got out there, and a lot of city leaders saw it. As far as recognition and awards, there may not be an award for a budget and brief, but there is some recognition. At least I've seen it from my elected officials. They very much appreciate it. And you have that with the PAFR as well. Plus, you have an awards program with the GFOA. A little bit about budget and brief. Really, there are no guidelines, rigid guidelines at all. It's very open-ended as to what you put in a budget and brief. What I've tried to do is try to give an overview, as you'll see from a link I think that we're going to provide later, an overview of the budget in terms of inflows and outflows, revenues and expenses. We give some ideas of what's going on in key funds, and we give some idea, such as the general fund. We give some idea of what the major items to be purchased in the budget are, as well as additional staffing packages, staffing changes, and it's kind of just an overview. But what does the GFOA say a budget and brief is? And this is about as much as I could find as far as what the GFOA's position is. A budget and brief can be presented as an internal or external feature that highlights major points from the budget document. Governments frequently use budgets and brief as a supplement to their main budget, and that's mostly what I'm talking about here today. Whether the presenting information in the budget and brief or in the main budget document, the effective use of tables, charts, graphics can help in communicating information that saves then saves narrative for analysis and interpretation. If you take a look at ours, there's not a lot of words in it. There are lots of pictures, there are lots of charts, there are some bullet points, there are some explanatory captions, but again, it's supposed to be something that makes it easy for a reader to digest. Now, what you could do in terms of preparing a budget and brief is you could take a look at the PAFR award guidelines, and that can help illuminate your process of preparing a budget and brief. Trend information is always helpful. Pictures with lots of years on it, so the common man can kind of look at it and get an idea of what's really happening in the government relative to the past. Here's some general concepts for preparing a budget and brief. In my view, it should be generally comprehensive. That is, include essentially all of the budget. You might not have component units in there, or you might have component units in there, but it should be generally cover the all the government's inflows and outflows. You might have a general introduction, and that general introduction might be just like a letter from the mayor or your manager. Could be an organization chart, could be some history of the city, how it came to be, just to give some context to your to the readers to what your organization is all about. One other item you might consider including is something on the budget process, that is how the budget gets in place. I think we're used to putting in timelines in our budgets for the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award, but something along those lines, or maybe abbreviated along those lines. Certainly including information about inflows and outflows. And again, it might be for specific important funds like the general fund in addition to the budget as a whole. Capital items. Those are a major demand on the resources of the government, so it only makes sense that there be some discussion someplace about capital items. Staffing changes. Are you adding staff? And what the costs might be involved in that. And there could be other, maybe non-capital items that are large in nature. Perhaps you're buying a lot of computers that are going to cost a fair amount of money, so that might be a bullet point somewhere in the budget and brief. Here's just an example. What Scott's done here is he's pulled a couple of pieces from two separate pages of our budget and brief, and this is where we kind of show the overall inflows and outflows of the government. You can see that with respect to the inflows, we've broken it out by the major revenue types: property taxes, sales taxes, and so on. And you could collapse some of that. If you go too much more in collapsing it, you might not get a real feel for what's going on. That's a matter of professional judgment. As far as expenditures go, you can see here what we've decided to do is to present expenditures by essentially fund type. You might take another approach. There's no required way to do it. You could break it out by natural expenditure classification, such as salaries and benefits, and then supplies, and so on. And as you can see here, the way we actually presented our budget, these were on two separate pages, the inflows and the outflows. What I have underneath one of the table on expenditures is a note, if someone were to compare the two, it looks like it doesn't balance. Well, we talk about also that we have on-hand cash to pay expenditures, which of course is, when you're talking about capital funds, that's to be expected. Okay, now maybe we'll go a little bit into, we've talked about the budget in brief, we'll talk a little bit about the PAFR. How do you become eligible for the GFOA award? I'm approaching it this way because I'm I've envisioned that you might construct your PAFR in such a way as to achieve the award. So if you're achieving the award, most likely you're going to have something that approaches an informative and useful document. So this GFOA awards eligibility applies only to the PAFR. There are other awards that the GFOA gives that have different sorts of criteria, even for the CAFR. You'll see that these criteria are actually not very rigorous in the sense that not very detailed. So you got a lot of discretion. One commonality with the CAFR award is that the PAFR has to be prepared within 6 months of the close of the fiscal year. So that's a bit of a trick. We'll talk about that later, so that you get it done at about the same time. You're doing some of this basically concurrently with the CAFR. It's a little tricky because you need, if you're going to report on a GAAP basis, you're going to need some of those numbers that are in the CAFR to build the PAFR. You must clearly outline the scope of the financial data presented. That is, if you are leaving out, for example, certain funds, or for example, you're leaving out component units, or whatever it is you're doing, it's required that you explain it. It's required that you actually mention that if you want more detail, go to the CAFR. And there should be an explanation, any differences between the numbers that are reported in the CAFR and GAAP basis. For example, if you had proprietary funds, for whatever reason, if you decided to report those on a budgetary basis within a PAFR, that should be explained, because normally the GAAP basis for that of course, is accrual basis in the economic resources measurement focus. As far as other things that the GFOA will look at in terms of evaluating this, you might say, well, this is kind of judgmental. That's exactly correct. The whole thing here is judgmental, or I would argue much of it is judgmental. It must be short enough to maintain interest, and in other words, if you've got a 50-page PAFR, you're probably wrong. It's defeating the whole purpose. Logical and easy to understand, just laid out in a way that, again, that common man, the layman, can understand what's going on. Topography is easy to read and appealing. The layout, the general layout of the document makes sense so that you can follow it. The photos, charts, and graphics, all included. It's what makes the whole document easy to digest and appealing. Avoids jargon and technical language. Those of us that are accountants can be really guilty of using a lot of jargon. So clearing all of that out of there, clearing out acronyms like GAAP just by standing by itself, should not be in there. Maybe an explanation of it first and then using it might work, but all the technical language should be out. Probably wouldn't be talking too much about measurement focus and basis of accounting in a PAFR because the layman's not going to understand it. And again, those narratives used to explain financial data, not a lot of text explaining changes like maybe like an MD&A, but you could use some bullets to briefly convey ideas. Also, things to think about, placing data in context. Actually, that is an important part of a PAFR. Charts, line charts that show trends, for example, maybe in a certain revenue source that's performing particularly well or not performing particularly well. Just throughout the document, trying to minimize the potential for misinterpreting. That's kind of tricky because you're abbreviating information, so it's this balance between abbreviating and not abbreviating so much or being so cryptic that the reader can't understand what's going on. So that essentially involves professional judgment. Distributing it to the appropriate audience by the appropriate medium. The PAFR, or the budget and brief for that matter, is not a document that's meant to be created and then stuffed in a desk drawer. It's intended to be seen by the public. So obviously, the one place you might want to put it is on your website. But there could be other places that you could distribute either one of these specialty documents. I mentioned earlier that we distributed it at the State of the City address. That would be, I think, a good place to do it. The report should reflect a notable achievement. In other words, it's a good professional product. It's not just something you slap together and try to send in for a GFOA award. That would not be in keeping with the spirit of the program. Innovative or creative, and boy, this is where Sikich helped, because I needed innovation and creativity. We again had a rough idea of how or what information we wanted to provide, but we could use some help in laying it out in a creative and artful way. The document needs to be useful, simply said. And it needs to be attractive. I mean, it has to be nice to look at, so somebody's going to want to look at it. As far as what I see as the steps in the process. And I think probably the most important part is number one, or the most time-consuming part, or the part that is really, if you don't get that right, it's going to make the rest painful. Figuring out what information it is you want to convey, and exactly how you might want to convey it. I don't think you have to have it actually completely nailed down, because that's where a designer like Sikich helps. But the designer is going to need some idea as to what it is you want to do. So what I did in this case is I kind of sat down with my staff and we went into a conference room. We put the GFOA's website on the screen, and what we did was we kind of flipped through PAFRs for a couple hours. PAFRs for a couple hours out on the GFOA website and said, okay, we like that, and you'd be amazed what you'll learn. You'll see some that's the document's kind of dense in terms of too much information, or something else that it doesn't look very professional. You know, we don't want it to look like that. So that's, I think, a very important step. And then giving your designer an idea of what it is you want. What I did was just basically gave Sikich a list. Now, maybe painfully, it changed over the course of time, because as we started to get into it, it didn't. We decided, we wanted to change it a little bit. But you got to start from somewhere, and then actually gathering the data, pulling the data together. And if you're talking about a PAFR, that actual data may not be until late in the process. So you're going to have to do something to get this process going, or it's going to be a scramble at the end. You won't make the deadline. Then you have designing some kind of a theme for the document, designing the document around the theme. And then you have the time, you need to make time for reviewing and revising, because there will be a lot of that. Things that made sense when it was kind of in a sterile, one-page, isolated review item, to when you actually see the whole document in front of you, you might say, oh, this doesn't make sense. We got to move these pages around, or this picture doesn't apply very well to what we thought we wanted to say. And then finalizing it and getting it out.
And just to complement what Brian said, you know, we try to take a very strategic approach with all of our projects of understanding the target audience, and so that's where we can also help in helping you try to think of putting on the shoes of your audience and your community and your stakeholders, and so really trying to see what they're going to want, what needs are what are the needs that they have to read and to learn about with regard to your community and your story. And so that really ties into that, you know, gathering the content that Brian is talking about here up front.
Okay, I'll just kind of give you a quick overview here of what you need to think about in terms of a timeline. This is just very broad sorts of milestones. This is based upon a calendar fiscal year like we are in Aurora. Our budget process starts about 9 months ahead of time. So in the March-April timeframe, we have a budget kickoff where we bring everybody in and tell them, what the guidelines are for preparing the budget, maybe tell them about new forms, that sort of thing. But you can't wait too long to get started on that budget and brief, because it's going to take some time, particularly in the first year, to get the layout going. In subsequent years, it would probably be easier. You will, I would imagine, change it. But if you have a departure point, it's a whole lot easier than starting from scratch. So long about the fall, in my judgment, if you want the document to be reasonably timely, you should be preparing a layout. In our case, our budget's passed, and the legal budget is passed in December. So at that point, you can really start pulling data out of the document and putting it in the budget and brief. On our timeline at the end of February, generally speaking, we need to have the budget into the GFOA. So long about that time, you probably want to have your budget and brief done. Here, no one has any kind of firm deadline for you, but if you go too far into the fiscal year, it's just not going to be a very useful document. Okay, PAFR, similar idea. We normally start our preliminary field work in the fall. For us, even though, as you look down to the bottom, the actual CAFR won't be done until May or June, you can't wait that long to get it together. So I would recommend on this kind of a calendar time frame, probably in November, the PAFR preparation begins with design and whatnot. Then fiscal year ending, okay, and of course we had audit field work a couple months after that. So along that timeline, you're continuing to design and hopefully getting everything ready. So as soon as the final numbers are ready to go, you can load them into the PAFR. At the same time, you're finalizing the PAFR and send them both to the GFOA. And this just presents that same timeline on a bit of a graphic presentation here. So you can see that there's, as you look at the financial activity, there's overlap between the CAFR and the PAFR, between financial reporting and budgeting. And you kind of see how it lays out in terms of the activities that you need to complete in order to get everything done, either by a deadline or in a reasonably timely fashion. I don't know, do you have any questions that have come in? No questions. Okay, then I will turn it over to Scott.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And we'll make these slides available to you as well, so you'll have this slide here that's showing the overlap as you are looking at your budget and brief for 2017, but at the same time looking at the PAFR for 2016. So as a point of reference for you, as Brian said, this is on the calendar year. But if you have any questions regarding the timeline or steps in the process, you can contact either one of us. I should just briefly mention, so many of you might know of us, Sikich, as a consulting firm, or you might know of us from the audit and tax side, but bringing the information to life is where our external marketing team comes into play. We were an agency that merged with Sikich several years ago, and so we're a team of creative designers. We have web design, print design, videography, and so we really try to look at your overall project, who are you trying to reach, and really how do we best tell that story. So some people don't realize that that's a part of our team here, but I just wanted to make sure that you understood how I fit into the process here at Sikich. So our design and creative process is what I want to go over on this project here, and so the agenda here with regards to the creative, I'm going to talk about organization and pagination, layout, the content and photography. Then also, how do we create a consistent brand identity? How do we create a theme? And then how do we go about revisions to finalize and distribute the document? So with organization and pagination, it's really important, as Brian was talking earlier, to understand the content, and having that meeting with your team and discussing what has been going on in our community and what is important to our audience. And so having that conversation early on is very useful. And if you decided to work with a team like ours, then we would want to be brought into that as well. And again, help interview you, ask some questions, really try to dig a little deeper into understanding what it is that's going to be important for that audience. Then assessing the order of the content is also really key, making sure that we're going to tell a story that connects and it's engaging, and it really helps move them from understanding your budget process, and as Brian talked about earlier, maybe the the organizational chart and the timing of things to then how that information is disseminated and communicated to the audience or to your constituents. Determining how many pages for the piece. That's where understanding the content is going to be really key. For as Brian talked about, if you're going 50 pages, then you're probably not being too concise. You're not comprehensive enough. So you want to make sure that you're able to get it into a fair amount of pages. And so for our budget and brief, we had a 12-page document, and our PAFR was a 16-page document. For us, we like to create, once we understand the general content, we like to create the layout prior to design, a general layout. So I want to show you here an example. This is a pagination sample here. And you can see that we have the back page, the cover page there, where we know there's going to be some sort of visual interest. And then Brian talked about a letter from the mayor. So that might lead off, the inside cover. Then a city council organizational chart, operational achievements, economic development accomplishments, and then we can get into maybe some more specifics, such as property tax or revenue trends and capital assets. But really trying to put together that layout ahead of time is going to help us know how many pages we need to address those topics and how that content is going to flow in an easy and digestible way. For photography, photography is really key. Photography tells your story, and some of you might be thinking, we don't have someone on staff that does photography, or well, I don't know where we would find it, or what we have might be old. So you might be asking, right now, well, what images will I need? And so for a piece like this, I mean, it's going to depend on that content and what we're highlighting. So there's a new development in your community. That's just a project that might be really well highlighted. But bringing out the people is also going to be important, making sure that they can see themselves reflected in your community, as important as that is. So we want to have that conversation early on as well. When it comes to photography, we have a photographer on our team, so we can help get photography for you, or you might want to also create a shot list of things that you would like to see throughout the year. So some ways that you can do that is by hiring a professional photographer to go out and get those pictures, but we really feel it's important to define what those shots are, what's important to you to telling your story, so that you can have that conversation with the creative director or the art director and the photographer before we get in too far into the project, so that those pieces, those shots can be identified, and so that you and the team can go out and get those. Sometimes you might use stock photography, and you might be thinking, well, that's not going to work, and sometimes it may not be appropriate for certain pieces. If you didn't have photos in your library, or if you didn't have a budget to go out and get the right photos, then that might be when stock imagery could come into play. And so on that, it might be a close-up of a smiling face, so reflecting the essence of someone that's in your community, but it might not be an actual photo from your community. So when budget wouldn't allow, that would be when we might recommend stock photography. Then you might want to set up a Dropbox or some sort of file sharing for your communication team, so that you guys can easily organize the photos and share those photos in a way, or you can put them on a thumb drive when they're all complete and ready for the design phase. And with that, one last question is what size or file types. You want to make sure that they're high resolution, so that they're going to print with good quality. So working with your designer, they can provide recommendations on that, so that, again, they're going to print and look very sharp for you.
Scott, it might be worth a comment here, and that is that you might think that you've got lots of photos on hand. You could be surprised to find you really don't, and that's what we did. We did our budget and brief first. We went to our public affairs office. We actually have a public affairs office that takes tons of pictures, or so we thought. And they did indeed have pictures, but when it actually came to pictures that were suitable to include in the document, we went through those pictures very quickly, because you might be looking for a specific theme or a specific location, a specific activity, and they may or may not. You may or may not have that in-house. So we did, when it came time to actually do the PAFR, which was several months after the budget and brief, we found that we needed to go out and get a photographer to take pictures, and lots of them. So actually, Sikich helped us with that, to find a photographer and get the pictures taken. So now we've got a good stock that will probably hold us for another year or so. But it's an important point. Don't assume that you've got a bunch of good pictures.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, in that you said for a year or so, each year you're going to want to make sure that you keep getting new photos, and something, new businesses come into town, you have new events, there's a new park, whatever it might be. There's different things that you're going to want to keep photos with, so to highlight. So just making sure that you can identify what those are going to be, and having someone dedicated to making sure that they can get those photos for you. So here's a few samples that we had in the brochure, so we can see we have some certain landmarks, some certain buildings, youth, recreation, music. So we're really trying to bring in, a parade here. So really trying to bring in various aspects of the city of Aurora. And I think that they all tied really well. You can take a look at the budget and brief and PAFR after the webinar today if you'd like. But I think they tied in really well to where we had them. All right, design theme. If you have a brand standards guide, that is a guide that helps you and your team internally with how to use your logo, how to communicate your brand externally. If you've gone through a city branding initiative at some point, that might be a document that they helped you with. If not, that might be something to consider in the future, and you can always start small and develop that as you grow. So with us, we like to have some sort of standards. And so if you don't have something in place, you might be looking at creating something new or allowing these pieces to help guide that process. But so for us, when we had the budget and brief in the PAFR, we really wanted to make sure that there was a consistent theme across both of the pieces. So we wanted to make sure that the imagery and the color both complement one another. So we're gonna look for helping to make sure that the color, the icons, your headings, subheads, your titles are all consistent, and so that's going to make sure that the audience knows there's visual hierarchy on the pages. They know where to look. It's not, as Brian said earlier, it's not too dense, so that we're really trying to communicate those specific bullets and making sure that the content is easy to read, but it's also engaging and visually interesting. So having some sort of standards with the design theme is going to be helpful to being consistent, and will help in years to come as well. So when it comes to design, we present, sometimes we can present multiple concepts, sometimes just one. It depends on the client and budget and goals and whatnot. But when it comes to then revising that content, there is a process that needs to be in place. And so whether it's both on the design and then also on the content itself, we need to make sure that they're complementing one another, and that we account for both of those in the design and the revision process here. So it's important, I think, to really define that process early on. There's going to be a timeline that you need to establish, because you're typically going to want to have these documents to the printer at least no more than the final document 1 week before you need them. So you need to determine, if you have a state of the city address, you need to determine when you need these documents printed by. So you want to work backwards and say, okay, so we need them to the printer at this date, and then you typically want to account for a few weeks potentially of revision, and it can be much more than that as well. But you want to have a few, probably no fewer than 3 rounds of revisions, and so we recommend a process of compiling those revisions into a Word document where you would outline the title or the page number, and then specific bullets of what you want changed, what you want modified, what needs to be added. There might be a chart that's missing because the data wasn't available at once before, as Brian was suggesting earlier. So making sure that you can have a placeholder in there, but then get that content when it is ready. So after the first round, we recommend that you proof and proof again. And then when you get to the second round, you're going to want to present to an executive team. So determining who's going to be on that executive team and making sure that they really take the time to look at this, that you guys have a good dialogue about this. For instance, there might be something that comes out of the process that you say, you know what, we really can't talk about that yet or anymore. You might need to refine some of the content. And so it's the challenge with this is sometimes you can't just take out one page, right? If you take it out one page, you got to really take out 4, right? Because it goes in 4s for a piece like this. So when you have a booklet, you got to determine how that content is laid out. You got to go back to your layout and determine what's going to be best. But there might be something else that can fill that space, and so just having an open dialogue with your team and making sure that the content, though, that is presented is necessary, and making sure that when you get to that final round, that everybody's in agreement. Maybe making some, maybe there's some trade-offs there about certain things, but making sure that the final changes are to everyone's approval. From there, you want to just determine the number of copies that you're going to need to hand out to the community. So determining how many aldermen you have, the mayor, finding out who is going to be excited to go ahead and present this piece into the community, and how many documents are they going to need. So we can talk through that with you and help you with that. And then once you have a number in place, you're going to rely on a team like ours to help you determine the right paper stock and the coatings, determine the binding, if it's a saddle stitch. And from there, once we have all of that presented, all of that finalized on the best way to present this document that's going to be something that you're proud of and your community is proud of, we can go out and help find quotes from multiple printers. And we just like to work as a design team, design and marketing team, we like to work with the printer throughout that process, so it's not a headache for you. We make sure that we're working with the printer, making sure that it's if we're getting multiple quotes, that we're comparing apples to apples, making sure that the quotes are consistent. And once you know that you know the costs, and we can also provide other pros and cons with different printers, making sure that we know that this printer might be better for this reason or whatnot. We want to give you the best recommendation. And if you want to work with someone that you worked with in the past or within your community, that's great too. But still having the designer work with the printer is a great way of making sure that the document is presented in the right file format, so that the printer has everything that they need. So then you're going to send the art files to the printer, or your designers will. They'll send the art files to the printer, and then the art designer should request a printer's proof. So we like to get a printer's proof to make sure that everything is aligned, everything is printing the way that we have designed it, making sure that the content is correct. And then from there you can you can sign off, or you can also look to see if there's any other possible changes. Sometimes there might be something that you missed. But that's where a trade-off is going to happen, because that's typically going to come at an additional cost if you have to change once you have the printer's proof. So it's just an internal checkpoint of saying, is this something that's necessary? Is this going to take more time and more cost than we have? But you want to make sure that that printer's proof is reviewed. Then determine delivery date, location, and making a list internally of who's going to receive these copies and what quantity. And from there, trying to do your best to get it out in the community. Share this document, making sure that people are excited to talk about it, making sure that they understand it. You can, as Brian mentioned, you can have it online and print. You could share it in social media. When it comes to measurements for this content, if you have it online, one option is making it gated content. So what that is, where you would request their email address to get the link to download it. That's an opportunity just to get an idea of how many people did download the document, and after the fact, you're able to then email them and ask them for feedback. If you just had it on your website, you could always have a quick survey, asking people that did come and review it if the information was helpful, if it was useful, what they found to be most appropriate, and what they enjoyed reading most. And then asking your aldermen and staff to forward any emails as they gather feedback, as Brian talked about earlier, that it's been very useful for them when they're out in the community. So finally, gathering all that feedback, you can review it, assess it with the communications team, and then determine how you want to improve for next fiscal year. Here's a quick checklist of essentials for you, and for you, I would recommend discussing your internal resources. Do we have the time and the team internally to create a document like this? And if so, what parts and who's going to do what? Or do we use a partner? So deciding, do we need to bring a partner in for the design, or do we need to bring a partner in to help get photography? Then having a meeting to discuss the content and the process, as Brian talked about earlier, and then determining the timeline and responsibility for all parties involved. And then you want to review, assess the design, the content, and revise as necessary, so that you can finally plan distribution and measurement. So very high level here for you over everything we've talked about today, but making sure that you have a process in place so that you can have this document prepared for you. Here is a link that will provide you in the slide deck to City of Aurora's budget and brief. And we also have a link as well for the PAFR. So you can look through all of these, assess it, and see how it might be similar to what you might do, or is it different from what you might do, give you a point of reference, and if it spurs any questions for either one of us, we'd be happy to answer those questions for you as well. So at this time, our presentation is available for any questions that you might have. Okay, so again, at the very end of this webinar, there will be a survey that's going to launch automatically, and we'd appreciate that if you'd have a moment to complete that for us. Brian, is there anything that we may have overlooked, or anything else that comes up that you feel like we should discuss? Or
I don't think so. I would only add that on that review stage in the first year that you're doing it, if you get through it in 3 reviews, you're doing well. It took us a whole lot more. It kind of placed some demands on Sikich, but they rose to the occasion. I'm hoping that in the second year of doing a couple of these documents that it'll go much faster.
Okay. Uh, Brian, if you'd had to, think of the greatest challenge in developing the budget and brief. I know you've kind of already talked on it, but the greatest challenge in developing the budget and brief for PAFR, what would you say?
Definitely, it's the initial design, because if you don't have the initial layout, at least some idea what you want to do, it's hard for the designer to be able to help you. And if you're kind of floundering around as to what you want, it's just going to take a lot of time. So what might be helpful, again, is to maybe go out to the GFOA's website and use that for the PAFR. You can probably use it as a proxy for the budget and brief as well. And you're welcome, as Scott pointed out, you're welcome to go download and take a look at mine. Not that it's the holy grail, but it does represent some lessons learned.
And on that, have you received any recommendations for changes to your budget and brief or PAFR externally or internally?
Actually, yes, we did receive, and this is a tough one, from one of our aldermen. He had said, well, with your budget and brief, what about if you incorporated benchmarks of other communities in to see how you're doing against them? It's an added level of complexity. There are public relations implications with something like that, but that was one recommendation that I received.
Okay, great, wonderful. Okay, well, at this time, it doesn't appear like we have any further questions, so we will go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, complete the survey for your CPE credits following this webinar, and go Cubs. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.